Good morning, my dear students. We are discussing chapter 5, A Face in the Dark. We already saw about the story, the theme of the story, and the setting of the story. Today, we are going to see the summary of the story. If we talk about the plot-wise development of the story, in the beginning, we can see that Mr. Oliver, an Anglo-Indian teacher in a school, is being introduced. And in the beginning, the story is giving little bit about the daily routine of this Anglo-Indian teacher. He visits the Simla Bazaar and spends an evening there. He takes a shortcut and walks through the pine forest. Mr. Oliver, the Anglo-Indian teacher, comes across a boy in the forest who has no eyes, ears, nose or mouth. The Anglo-Indian teacher is getting frightened, runs towards the school building and cries for help. He stumbles up to the watchman and gasping for breath. He fancies that the watchman has no eyes, no ears, no features at all, not even an eyebrow. So that is the plot-wise development of this story. Now we will see the summary of this story. The story has its setting on the outskirts of the hill station of Simla. The main character of the story is Mr. Oliver, an Anglo-Indian teacher teaching in a school. Mr. Oliver, after visiting Simla Bazaar, moving down the narrow forest path with a torch. He finds a boy sitting on a rock, recognizes the miscreant and sensed that something was wrong. Mr. Oliver felt uneasy, wanted to know the cause of his trouble. The boy's face had no eyes, ears, nose or mouth. First we will see Mr. Oliver, a teacher in a school. A Face in the Dark is a short story by Ruskin Bond that revolves around Mr. Oliver, an Anglo-Indian teacher. Mr. Oliver was returning to his school late one night on the outskirts of the hill station of Simla. He had been teaching in a school in Simla that had been run on English public school lines. The Simla Bazaar, with its cinemas and restaurants, was about 3 miles from his school. Mr. Oliver, a bachelor, usually strolled into the town in the evening. He would return after dark and take a shortcut through the pine forest. The students, those who study in that schools, are from wealthy Indian families. They wore blazers, cap and ties. Life magazine, in a feature on India, had once called it the Eden of the East. Mr. Oliver had been teaching in the school for several years. So the first 2 paragraphs of this chapter is introducing Mr. Oliver and also talking about the school and the students, those who are learning there, and also about Simla Bazaar. These 2 paragraphs gives us an idea about Mr. Oliver and his daily routine. When we move to the 3rd, 4th and 5th paragraphs, we will find out that Mr. Oliver is finding a boy in that pine forest. When there was a strong wind, the pine trees made sad, eerie sounds that kept most of the people to the main road. But Mr. Oliver was not too nervous or imaginative man. This is a place where the author gives us a picture of Mr. Oliver, that he is not a nervous man, he is not an imaginative man, he is a very brave man. The sad and eerie sound of the pine tree made fear in the hearts of most of the people. Because of that people did not use the pine forest, the shortcut way, but they used the main road to reach their homes. But our Mr. Oliver was brave enough to walk through that pine forest at that dark night. Even though the pine forest made sad and eerie sounds, our Mr. Oliver still was brave enough to walk through that forest. He was moving down the narrow forest path. He was carrying a torch, and it was gleaming because the batteries were running down. He moved fitfully down the path. There he saw the figure of a boy in the light of the torch. He found him sitting alone on a rock. Mr. Oliver stopped there. He thought that boys were not supposed to be out after dark. Mr. Oliver recognizes the figure. Mr. Oliver moved closer to the figure in order to recognize the miscreant and said, "What are you doing out here, boy?" He sensed that something was wrong. The boy appeared to be crying. His head hung down, and he held his face in his hands, and his body shook convulsively. It was a strange, soundless weeping, and Mr. Oliver felt uneasy. "Well, what's the matter?" he asked, his anger giving way to concern. "What are you crying for?" The boy neither answered nor looked up, but continued sobbing. Mr. Oliver told the boy that he should not be out there at that time. Mr. Oliver asked the boy to tell the trouble and look up. Then the boy looked up. He took his hands from his face and looked up at his teacher. The light from Mr. Oliver's torch fell on the boy's face, if you could call it a face. It had no eyes, ears, nose or mouth. It was just a round, smooth head with a school cap on top of it. The torch fell from the shivering hands of Mr. Oliver. He turned and scrambled down the path, running blindly through the trees and calling for help. He was still running toward the school building when he saw a lantern swinging in the middle of the path. Mr. Oliver stumbled up to the watchman, gasping for breath. "What is it, Sahib?" asked the watchman. "Has there been an accident? Why are you running?" the watchman inquired. Then Mr. Oliver replied, "I saw something horrible, a boy weeping in the forest, and he has no face." "No face, Sahib?" The watchman expressed his doubt. "No eyes, nose, mouth, nothing," exclaimed Mr. Oliver. "Do you mean it was like this, Sahib?" asked the watchman, and raised the lamp to his own face. The watchman had no eyes, no ears, no features at all, not even an eyebrow, and that's when the wind blew the lamp out. Dear students, please read the chapter and try to find out the answers for your workbook exercises. Thank you.